This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a Jewish history scholar, a post-doctoral fellow at the Tel Aviv University, whose main area of expertise is the evolution of gender segregation in the Israeli public sphere. And for the purposes of today's discussion, we're going to talk about beaches, gender-segregated beaches in Tel Aviv. Dr. Shayna Weiss, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi, good morning.
So, the first calls for gender segregation on the Tel Aviv seafront were made as early as the 1920s. So that's shortly after Tel Aviv was established. Was that really the first instance in history that such calls were made? Was it a unique setting where Jews and seaside leisure met for the first time?
So no, there's a large history of Jewish engagement with seaside culture and with spa culture in Europe. And it's crucial to understand that as a background for what's going on in 1920s Tel Aviv. What was going on in Europe was a seaside revolution, which these spaces were made as sites of leisure consumption for the general public. And at these sites, there was a lot of discussion about propriety at the seashore, and gender segregation was one of the ways in which governments, public institutions decided that the beaches could be made appropriate and not be a site of untoward mixing between men and women.
Not just for Jews?
And not just for Jews and not just for religious reasons. It was considered culturally appropriate, sort of like Thomas Mann and Magic Mountain. If you think of spa culture and sort of high Central European spa culture, that's what at least some of the Tel Aviv immigrants were trying to do when they thought about what the beach was going to look like in 1920s Palestine.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that it had really nothing to do with religion?
There were religious people who wanted gender segregation at the beaches, but there are plenty of non-religious people who thought that gender segregation was just part of an appropriate way as part of how one went to the seashore and engaged in waterside activities.
Mm-hmm. So tell us a bit about how they perceived this propriety. Was it really just about segregating the genders, or was it really more about conduct and behavior and other things as well?
If you consider the whole experience of taking to the waters, that's an experience that was developed with health benefits in mind. We forget that the sea was perceived as a public health benefit. If we think about a time where access to water, access to showers was rarer than what it is today, the sea has public health benefits for bathing, and also for relief from the heat. This is an era before air conditioning, and this is especially true in the Mediterranean. If we think about all of those things, and we think about additionally the fact that one needs to generally unclothe a bit, but when one gets near the water, it's something that scholars call visual intimacy. Mm-hmm. It sets up all sorts of tensions, or it reinforces all sorts of cultural tensions. And so when different kinds of people come into contact, whether it's racial conflicts or gender conflicts, we see automatically, not just in Israel and not just in Europe, that people put restrictions in place to try and prevent mixing of all different sorts of people that would never come into place.
Mm-hmm. So if it's really a more of a question of cultured propriety, did it come in a top to bottom sort of way from the British authorities that ruled the country at the time?
So you see a conflict between the British authorities and between the Jewish Council in Tel Aviv. The Jewish Council in Tel Aviv is constantly trying to get morality rules passed. The British authorities, even though they're technically interested in these rules of propriety, have very little interest in getting involved with morality policing and vice squad. And we see that not just with gender segregation on the beach, but with all sorts of sort of public morality. And we see a very strong reluctance on the part of the British authorities to get involved. There's one part where the mayor of Tel Aviv writes to a mandate official and asked for permission to criminalize public bathing without a costume, without a proper bathing suit. And the British mandate officials write back in the most British way possible that the appearance of the human form inadequately clad is inartistic but may not be criminal. So again, there's this debate between to what extent law enforcement, police should get involved with actually policing people's behaviors.
Mm-hmm. So was it the policing, did it become unofficial? Were there any vigilantes going around beaches trying to make young Jewish women look more modest?
No, but you see a lot of complaints. And from these complaints, you get a sense that things were said to people. The lifeguards actually became the unofficial enforcers of morality, which some lifeguards were happy to do and some lifeguards were less happy to do, because people would complain to the lifeguards that people were inappropriately clad or otherwise behaving inappropriately. And the lifeguards usually refused to get involved, but sometimes they would. And usually that person would then complain to the municipality. We have dozens and dozens and dozens of complaint letters, not just about gender-segregated bathing, but about all sorts of things, about life in Tel Aviv. And those are one of the best sources I use to talk about in my dissertation.
Tell us a bit about that. What kind of, anecdotes and curiosities that you found in these documents?
So you see all sorts of stories. And one of the favorite things I saw is a letter in English from a Dutch woman who apologizes for not being able to write in Hebrew. And she talks about going to the beach on a Saturday, which therefore we know that she's not religious, which is why it's also an interesting anecdote. And she talks about seeing people inappropriately unclad. And even worse, they're not just wearing their bathing suits on the beach, they're wearing them in the cafes next to the beach. So we see this beach culture creeping. And she's one of these people who goes to the lifeguard to ask him to intervene. He refuses. And she reports back to the municipality that this is going to make us look bad with the eyes of the world. There's a real concern in the mandate period that immorality, public immorality, is going to make Jewish settlement in Palestine look like it's bourgeoisie, look like it's decadent, and therefore not worthy of nationalist fervor and things like that.
So really that was the motivation, how they will be perceived by others.
That too, and also the idea that leisure is inherently problematic. Leisure has a tendency to become decadent, has a tendency to become hedonistic, and it was very important for the Zionist founders to channel that leisure into a proper direction, to make sure that it was properly nationalist and served the interests of the state.
Mm-hmm. Your research focuses on Tel Aviv, but could you say the same issues that you're exploring happened elsewhere in the country as well?
Yes, they definitely did. There are lots of fights about beaches in all sorts of areas, shoreline areas. There's also a very famous fight about the first public swimming pool in Jerusalem, which opened in 1958. When the plans were announced to open this pool, the ultra-Orthodox community in Jerusalem and the rest of the world got very upset at what they saw as an attempt to introduce mixed swimming into Jerusalem. There were huge rallies, 20,000 people, 30,000 people marching in a divided Jerusalem in 1958 against this pool. There were also
but they were all religious, right? So they came from a very different place to the ones in 1920s Tel Aviv.
Right. So in Tel Aviv, you do see some religious voices. We do have documents from Rav Kook, the first chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Palestine, who sort of joined forces with the more conservative parts of the Central European immigrants in Tel Aviv. But what happens is, as time goes on, and in the 1930s is really when we see this change, the support for gender segregation drops out from the secular community. Norms change. There's also the rise of the modern bathing suit dates to the 1930s. And therefore, we see that the religious community is sort of left alone arguing for gender segregation. Mm-hmm. And they no longer have these Central European, more conservative norms to ally with, because those voices are gone.
So that means that the controversy, as it were, was on the decline, I'm assuming, because especially in the early days, Tel Aviv was never a very religious city, but especially in the early days, the number of religious people in Haredim was tiny, wasn't it?
So it's small, but it's bigger than we think. What people don't necessarily think of is that Tel Aviv has always had a sizable Orthodox community, and even at some points a sizable Haredi community. Before Bnei Brak became Bnei Brak in the 50s, there were several groups of Hasidim who made their homes in Tel Aviv. And there's still some there today. There's still a Belzer community in South Tel Aviv. And even though it was small, it was always a strong part of the discourse in Tel Aviv, and a larger part than what we remember, because Tel Aviv has defined itself as a secular city. The deputy mayor of Tel Aviv, who plays a large role in my research, was a member of Agudat Yisrael, the ultra-Orthodox party, and he was the mayor for almost 30 years, or deputy mayor.
Who was that?
Yehuda Meir Abramowitz.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that Tel Aviv wasn't really, was more religious than we think. But at the end of the day, also, if we go back to what we said about the tension between bourgeoisie and, the ethos of the labor movement, Tel Aviv was really an exception to the rule in this sense too, wasn't it? Because it was an urban area and, the epicenter of the Jewish bourgeoisie at the time. The victory, as it were, of the bourgeois here, did it signify something that had wider repercussions on the development of Zionism?
Well, I think while all those things are true, we have to remember that this epicenter of the bourgeoisie is only a small part of Tel Aviv's history, and that there are other populations whose stories have not been told as much, like the ultra-Orthodox community, also the Mizrahi community, which tends to be focused in the South Tel Aviv. In fact, when the beaches finally opened, which it opens in northern Tel Aviv, a lot of northern Tel Aviv residents, which is a more secular area, say this beach should have been put in South Tel Aviv, where the more religious members of the community are. And additionally, in terms of Tel Aviv, it's an urban Zionism. And Zionism has always had a complicated relationship with cities and how it views cities because of the emphasis on kibbutzim and collective living, collective agricultural settlements. In Tel Aviv, we see a bit of a different development, and we see the development of an urban Zionism that really relishes city experience, is much more capitalist, is often less socialist than the head of the labor movements would like to see.
And therefore the more tolerant of, recreation and leisure and, what some very hardline socialists would call bourgeois decadence?
Exactly. And even with that, there's a fear that we have to make this appropriate and we have to keep this in line. Also, even more than that, there's a lot of concerns about just the physical conditions of the beach. These beaches are extremely overused. There's a lot of people in Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv grows very, very fast, especially during the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And there are constant complaints about pollution, about the boardwalk being broken, about all sorts of trash on the beach. Beaches are constantly being closed and reopened for pollution. So there's a lot of growing pains we see here. And when you study the history of the Tel Aviv beach, it's also a great way to study the rapid growth of Tel Aviv and how the city government, especially during the mandate period, which was sort of caught between not having full power and having to approve everything with the British authorities, really struggled to keep up.
Mm-hmm. And also during the mandate period, we have to bear in mind that at the time, one of the biggest cities in Palestine, if not the biggest, Jaffa, a Palestinian city, was just a couple of kilometers down the road, and also shared the seafront with Tel Aviv. Did Palestinians and Jews intermingle on the beaches, or was the ethnic segregation already showing at the time?
So people tended to go to beaches that are closer to them. So the Palestinian community was generally further south. At the same time, there's a lot of concern that inappropriate behavior on the beach will draw especially Palestinian men to look on upon Jewish women unclad or inappropriately clad. And we see concerns from rabbinate officials, from Tel Aviv officials saying that we need gender segregation because Palestinian men are going to come look at Jewish women.
Were these concerns justified at all, or was it just a moral panic?
I'm sure there are instances of harassment and things like that. Concerns about widespread conspiracies of Palestinian men coming to look at Jewish women in bathing suits, that I would put as a moral panic. But we do have recorded incidents of harassment. At the same time, of course, all sorts of men harassed all sorts of women. It was not just based on ethnicity.
Mm-hmm. But was there any specific features to the interaction between Jews and Arabs on Tel Aviv beaches, Tel Aviv or Jaffa beaches?
So if anything, what's interesting is that the Palestinian in the interaction is almost male, which fits in our understandings of cultural encounters and fears of Native men preying on white women, which we see in a lot of places. Unfortunately, I didn't see a lot of sources about actual interaction on beaches. By the time I saw the sources, they were often secondhand and third-hand stories, so it's very difficult to sort of figure out what had actually happened on the beach.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fast forward to 1966. This is the year where the first ever segregated beach is declared, the Sheraton beach in northern Tel Aviv. Tell us a bit about the bureaucratic machinations that led to its being declared as a segregated beach.
So the fight actually takes a very long time. Tel Aviv beaches had actually been declared officially gender segregated since their very inception due to the European influences that I discussed earlier. However, no one ever paid any attention to this gender segregation. So therefore you have from the very beginning letters and complaints and lobbying to enforce the gender segregation along all of Tel Aviv's beaches. And for a long time, that's what the Tel Aviv rabbinate is advocating for. They want the entirety of the shoreline to be segregated. No one in the municipality is really sympathetic to this idea, especially...
Not even Mr. Abramovich?
So we'll talk about that in a second.
Okay.
And there's just concerns and promises, yes, we'll take care of it, and that sort of thing. In the 1950s, the ultra-Orthodox party I mentioned earlier, Agudat Yisrael, which is a non-Zionist party, it's important to emphasize they're non-Zionists, they're not anti-Zionists, enters city politics. And they decide, or really Abramowitz decides, that setting up a separate beach is going to be his personal crusade. This is his thing. He is going to get it done. And he changes the rhetoric. So instead of arguing that this is religiously necessary, that this is harmful to Tel Aviv's morality, he argues that we're going to have one separate beach, or that he wants one separate beach, not the entire shoreline to be segregated, and that we need this because it's the appropriate thing for a multicultural democracy to do. These are people who want to go to the beach, who otherwise can't. There's a real public interest in them going to the beach for the same reasons we mentioned earlier. It's considered healthy, it's good for them, it's appropriate leisure activity, and we as a city government are obligated to set up a way for them to access the beach.
Were religious, especially Haredi people, ever bothered with recreation and leisure activity?
There were debates. At the same time, there's a very long tradition of Haredi rabbis, and especially Hasidic rabbis, going to spas in Europe. There's a great book called Next Year in Marienbad, and there's an entire chapter which talks about how one of the Agudat Yisrael conventions actually takes place at Marienbad, one of these vacation spa resorts in Central Europe. And we have stories of Hasidic rabbis who would walk on the beach in Tel Aviv early in the morning before anyone got there. There is a real appreciation for going to the beach, for taking to the waters, for leisure activity and European Haredi culture that definitely transfers to Palestine. The sort of more radical anti-leisure elements, I would say, come up later. Mm-hmm. Much later in Israeli history.
Exactly. So, and then I think well into the 70s, it was when there was actually a national law passed, that in every seaside community there would be a declared beach with segregated
initiated by Abramowitz, who at that time was serving in the Knesset. It was the same person. This was his crusade. That and seatbelts were his two things that he's remembered for. The Haredi newspapers, when they eulogize him in 2007 when he passes away, says that he cared for the spiritual and physical safety of the Jewish people. Physical safety saying everyone has to wear a seatbelt, and spiritual safety separating the separate beach.
Mm-hmm. And in memory of Mr. Abramowitz, we will wrap up. Dr. Shayna Weiss, Jewish history scholar and a post-doctoral fellow at Tel Aviv University. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And also big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this podcast, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick.